So now chapter 7, titled Consumers, Producers, and the Efficiency of Markets. This chapter, along with the next two, chapters 8 and 9, basically are one big chapter. The author decided to break it up into pieces, and I kind of appreciate that. But at the same time, I think it intimidates students to see, this many chapters being covered. At the same time, or at least that are going to show up on the exam. Why? Because it's a lot of chapters. It seems like it's 3 chapters. Holy cow. But like I said, it's really one big fat chapter. Okay, one big chapter. And so this particular chapter is teaching you a tool, the tool known as welfare analysis. And then the next 2 chapters, chapter 8 and chapter 9, are applications of the tool. So that's why I keep saying it's one big chapters, chapter 7, 8, and 9. So let's learn the tools early on here. And so consumers, producers, and the efficiency of markets. What we'll be covering here, we'll talk about the concept of consumer surplus and how it relates to the demand curve. Similarly, producer surplus and how it relates to the supply curve. And then we'll talk about the allocative efficiency of markets and when markets can be improved upon, and when actually if we intervene in the market surplus as a whole or efficiency can actually decrease. And so this particular chapter, again titled Consumer Surplus, Producer Surplus, and the Efficiency of Markets, could also be titled Welfare Economics. Welfare economics, let me actually back up. Welfare economics is the study of welfare from markets. And by welfare, I don't mean like welfare programs like food stamps. That's not what I mean by welfare. By welfare, we mean well-being. Studying the well-being to market participants from the existence of the market. If you trade in the market, either as a buyer or a seller, why are you doing it? You're doing it because you're better off. So what this chapter does, it teaches us how to measure this better offedness. And I totally made that word up. It doesn't make any sense. It's not a proper English word, but who cares? Better offedness, right? We're saying that we're better off because we're participating in the market. Again, this does assume that markets are free markets and that we're trading voluntarily, that we want to be there. No one is forcing us to be there. This is what we mean by free markets, free of government intervention. Anytime you hear free market, we mean free of government intervention. No one's forcing us to be there. And so that is an assumption. Whether it's the government or somebody else forcing you to be there, then it's not a free market. So if there's a pimp and a prostitute, that's not a free market if she's being forced or if he's being forced to be in the market, or like sex trade markets where some people are being forced to be there. That is not a free market. If they're not being forced to do that and they choose to do that, then that's a free market. Remember, we have no value judgments in this class. We're here to analyze markets and why people trade, people as buyers or firms as sellers as well. So welfare analysis, measuring the well-being to market participants. And so remember, we've been talking about markets and how they allocate resources, right? From the beginning, chapter 1, markets help us identify supply and demand and that price. How much of each good is going to be produced? Q star. Which producers produce it, right? The low-cost producers would be the first one to produce it as long as that price covers their cost. Remember, we said that supply curve is a ranking of the cost of production. And which consumers consume it? Those with the highest willingness and ability to pay, as long as it's above their price that they're paying, then they're going to consume it, right? So again, remember, the demand curve is a ranking of willingness and ability to pay. We'll come back to these concepts that I'm just briefly mentioning here. So welfare economics studies how the allocation of resources affects economic well-being, right? This better offedness from the existence of the market. So let's talk about consumers first. Introducing you once again to a concept, formally introducing you to the concept of willingness to pay. We're going to denote it by WTP. I will take a moment here to once again point out that yes, we're only calling it willingness to pay. It should really be called willingness and ability to pay, because I keep saying, yeah, I'm willing to buy a Tesla, but I, Professor Morales, am not able to buy a Tesla. Actually, I'm not really willing to buy it. But anyway, suppose I were willing to buy a Tesla because I wanted one. I really don't. Suppose I did. I'm willing to, but I'm not able to. Okay. All right. So willingness to pay. Okay, a buyer's willingness to pay for a good is the maximum amount the buyer will pay for that good. Think about again the shirt on your back right now. What's the most you would have paid for that shirt? Right? There's some maximal value. You may not know exactly what it is. You don't know if it's $20 or $20.22. You know it's not 2000. You know it's maybe not 40. You know it's probably maybe above 5, $6, right? It depends on the person. It might depend on the time. If it's cold, you might be more willing and able to pay, right? But we have this maximal amount that we're willing to pay for a good or for a service. So it measures the value that we place on the good as buyers. So imagine we have these 4 individuals, Anthony, Chad, Flea, and John. Do you guys recognize them? They are the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And we're talking about an iPod here. I need to update these slides and I need to write an iPad or something different because I know you folks don't buy iPods anymore. Anyway, I don't even know if they still make iPods. Anyway, so iPod or an MP3 player. The willingness to pay for each of them is listed here, with Flea having the highest valuation for the good, John having the lowest. And we're going to ask ourselves, if the price is 200, who would be willing and able to pay? At a price of 200, only, let's see who would buy it. Flea would buy it and Anthony would buy it, right? So Flea and Anthony would buy it because that price is lower than their willingness to pay, lower than what they value the good at, and therefore the quantity demanded at that price. Remember, at a particular price, how many units would they buy? The answer is quantity demanded. So the quantity demanded would be 2 when the price is 200. So we could do it in ranges. If the price is above 300, no one's going to buy it. If it falls between 251 and 300, let's assume that Flea would get it if it's at 300. Technically, Flea would be indifferent, and I'll actually show you that indifference in a bit. But if it's lower than 300 or at 300, he wouldn't say no, right? At 300, he'd be like, eh. But whatever, just assume he gets it. So quantity demanded would be 1. And it's not until the price falls at or below Anthony's willingness to pay that Anthony would join Flea in the purchase of the iPod. And then it's not until the price falls low enough for Chad to want to buy it, right? If it falls at 175 or lower, Chad's in with Anthony and Flea, so the quantity demanded would be 3. And then finally, when the price falls low enough to be below John's willingness to pay, then John would join them, and there goes the quantity demanded, right, of 4. So notice as the price drops, the quantity demanded increases. We can actually plot this information. So all I did was keep the P and the QD from the previous page. And if the price is above 300, no one's buying it. Quantity demanded is 0. At 300, this is, I think it was Flea. Flea is indifferent between getting it, 1, and not getting it, right? Because the price is his willingness to pay. But if the price drops below that, and so long as it's still above 250, Anthony's not joining him, but Flea is definitely buying it, right? And then when the price hits 250, there is Anthony's indifference, right? And Anthony's indifferent between definitely buying it with Flea or not getting it, and therefore just having Flea be the purchaser there. But if the price falls below Anthony's willingness to pay, Anthony's like, yep, hell yeah, I'm joining, because the price is below Anthony's willingness to pay. Right? And then we'll do it again for the other 2 individuals. Here's the indifference for the 3rd individual, joining them or not joining them. But if the price falls below 175, definitely joining them. So the quantity demanded would be 3. And then the 4th individual, which I think is Chad. Once the price hits 125, there's this indifference between getting it, taking us to a quantity demanded of 4, or not getting it and keeping it at 3. Again, because the price is equal to willingness to pay, right? The price is equal to what you value the good at. You're like, I'll get it, or I won't. But if the price falls below what you value the good at, then you, the last person, I think it's Chad, would definitely join in on the fun of purchasing, right? So this is the type of demand curve we would get with this story. This is, by the way, called a kinky demand curve. That is a real technical economic term. Kinky demand curves, because it's got kinks. Okay? And so it's important to understand to be able to build them, and MindTap will have you practice these. And let's look at this is if we get more and more buyers, right? If we just have a few of them, let me erase this. If we just have a few of them, it's kinky like that. But the more and more buyers that you get, these little kinks become really small, right? Imagine I'm making a staircase. I don't know why I started making noises. I was moving my hand and I remembered you can't see me. Anyway, so imagine I'm adding more and more people, then those staircases get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Eventually, if the market is big enough, if you add enough buyers to the market, the demand curve smooths out. Okay? And in fact, a good analogy for that on how a smooth curve comes from all these little ridges is like the table in front of you. It's I probably can bet that the table in front of you, if you touch it, it's pretty smooth. I doubt anyone has like a table with sandpaper feeling. You know, when you touch it, it feels like sandpaper. You know, it's smooth. Touch the table right now. It's smooth. So, and it looks smooth. But if you were to get a microscope and zoom in and get into at the really, really, really small microscopic level, you would see all the little bumps and all the ridges, right? So same thing here. This is kind of zooming in when you only look at a few buyers, but when you add more and more buyers to the market, it actually smooths out and we'll get a regular looking demand curve that we've been drawing all along. Any particular buyer here would be what we call the marginal buyer at a particular price. Like who would be purchasing that particular unit, right? So the marginal unit, the second unit, who buys it? It would be Anthony buying that, right? That's our marginal buyer. There's Flea's willingness to pay. He's the marginal buyer there, the first one. The second one is Anthony. He's the marginal buyer. He'd buy at $2.50 or lower. And then the third one was Chad, and John was the fourth one. I confused it earlier. And so again, the marginal buyers that we have listed there. Big important concept here is consumer surplus. Consumer surplus, let me erase this. You actually already know what consumer surplus is. You, as a buyer, think about it. Do you like low prices or do you like high prices? Low prices, right? And you value a good or a service at a particular price, and at a particular valuation that you have of it, a particular willingness to pay. The lower the amount that you actually pay, the happier you are when you walk away, right? Or the more satisfied you are, or the greater the better offedness. So let's say, think about a gallon of gas. Suppose you drive, in case you don't. I think many of you do, but some of you may not because you live near campus and you're biking. But you know, a gallon of gas. Let's say you value it. What's the most you'd be willing to pay for that? If you're paying for gas right now, then I know at least like $4 or so, because that's what we're paying at least right now. Who knows? Maybe by the time you watch this recording, it'll have dropped, or maybe it'll have gone up. I don't know. But roughly right now, about $4. So I, as an economist, when I observe you purchase a gallon of gas, that tells me you at least value it at that much at whatever price you paid. Right? That's information. This is what we call, by the way, revealed preferences. Your behavior reveals to me what you like to do, what you're not necessarily like, hey, I'm happy to go buy gas, but what you're willing to do, okay? And what you value goods at. And so, you know, let's say you value a gallon of gas at most $5. I know you're like, oh my God, no, I'd hate that. But would you buy it if you had to? You might, okay? And if you do, if you're willing to pay that, and the lower the price is, $4, $3, $2, $1 per gallon, the more stoked you are, right? You're going to be like, hell fucking yes, the price is low. Yes, right? Every time you go to the gas station and the price is low, aren't you like, there's a little part of you inside that's like, yes. That is consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is the difference between willingness to pay and price. So if you're willing to pay $5 for a gallon of gas, I'm not saying you want to. I'm saying that's the most you'd be willing to pay for it. And you pay $2, your consumer surplus is $3 for that gallon, right? This measure of better offedness from participating in the market. We call it consumer surplus for consumers. Again, you're willing to pay $5, but you paid $2. This yes value is $3 of yes, okay, as a consumer. Okay, so let's look at this example again. Suppose the price is $260. Ask yourself, who would be willing and able to pay? In this case, it would only be Flea, not even Anthony. Anthony won't buy it because that price is too high. It's above his willingness to pay, willingness and ability to pay. So Flea purchases it, values it at 300, pays 260, so therefore Flea's consumer surplus is $40. No one else is buying it in the market, and therefore total market consumer surplus is $40. And we can show this graphically here. This is the same graph we came up with before. If the price is 260, there's one unit being purchased, we can get the difference between willingness to pay and the price paid, get the value of that area, and that is $4, right? It's 40, the height of this difference here, 300 minus 260, times one unit being purchased. So consumer surplus in this case is $40, and there it is depicted right there in green. So total consumer surplus is $40. Suppose the price drops to 220. Now Anthony's like, okay, yes, I'm in. Flea's consumer surplus is going to change because he still values it at 300, but now he's only paying 220. Therefore, Flea's consumer surplus is $80. This yes of getting the good. And Anthony's buying it too. His yes isn't as big because his willingness to pay is lower, but he still has some consumer surplus, right? He values the good at 250. He paid 220, so therefore he's walking away with a consumer surplus of $30, leaving us with a total market consumer surplus, the total better offness measure. We're quantifying the benefits to buyers of market participation, and it equals $110 in this example. Notice that it is the difference between the red and the blue. And remember, the red was our kinky demand curve. So consumer surplus will be the difference, the area literally between the red curve, the demand curve, that's the red one, and price, up until the amount of units that are purchased. And that'll come in useful later. There it is. Total consumer surplus equals the area under the demand curve and above price up until the amount of units that are purchased. That is consumer surplus, one of our big important concepts here. Okay, with lots of buyers, as I said earlier, we smooth out the demand curve. Here we're talking about shoes, so price per pair, quantity of shoes in thousands, and there's our smooth demand curve. And if we were to zoom in, we'd see all the little kinky steps right here. But we're not. We've zoomed out. And so this is 20,000 pairs. This is 15,000 pairs. It's all of us who buy shoes. And the marginal buyer is the, like for example here, this is the marginal buyer, whoever buys the 5,000th pair, not the 5,000, the 5,000th pair of shoes, according to our demand curve, values it at $50. Whoever ends up getting the 15,000th pair of shoes, according to our demand curve, they value it at $30 or so, somewhere around here. Okay, so that's our marginal buyer. Suppose the price is $30. For our marginal buyer whose willingness to pay, remember the demand curve represents willingness to pay. So if you're drawing this right now, I hope you are, I would point to this curve. I would put an arrow right here, pointing here, like I'm drawing it. Pretend this is a pencil. And then I'm drawing an arrow pointing that way, pointing to this demand curve. And I'd say willingness to pay. I'd write it right here, willingness to pay, pointing to the demand curve, because the demand curve represents willingness to pay. So whoever's buying this 5,000th pair of shoe values it at $50, only pays $30, and therefore that difference between willingness to pay for that pair of shoes and the price paid is the consumer surplus for whoever's getting that pair of shoes. That's just one of them. There's a bunch of them here. There's consumer surplus here for whoever gets that one. There's consumer surplus here, this distance. This distance, someone values it at that much, pays $30. Someone values it at that much, pays $30. Someone values it at that much, pays $30. So if we aggregate across all of them, we get the total consumer surplus from market participation. All right, so we end up getting this area here, adding up across all consumer surpluses for each of these units. And notice that that concept of consumer surplus being identified by the area below the demand curve and above price up until the amount of units that are sold, or the amount of units that are bought, same thing, then that identifies consumer surplus. Right? And so you'll need to find the area of this triangle to find consumer surplus at a price of $30. And remember, the area of a triangle is 1/2 times the base times the height. So our height here is 30. 60 minus 30 is 30. And our base is 15. So 1/2 times the base times the height is 225. And remember what consumer surplus is measuring. It's measuring the benefits to buyers from market participation. So it's the value of this yes of when buyers buy something. Okay. And you might be like, oh my God, that's nothing. It's only $225. Ladies and gentlemen, these quantities are in thousands. So this is really 15,000. That means this is really $225,000 worth of yes. That is just the market for shoes. And this is a realistic example of that because prices of shoes are kind of like sort of a bit $30-ish, right? Around there. I know, again, not a proper English sentence, but who cares? And then we do buy shoes in the thousands. Not you and I, but the market for shoes is certainly, depending on, how big of a geographic region you're covering, but even just Santa Barbara, it's probably way higher, definitely is way higher than 15,000, right? So this is kind of like an underestimate of the benefits just to buyers from participating in the market. All right, so remember, consumer surplus is a measure of the benefits to buyers from market participation. So now let's see what happens if we change the price, right? Previously, on the previous price, there was consumer surplus, which we estimated to be at 225,000, really. And now if the price increases, notice that consumer surplus shrinks, right? Remember, it's the difference between the demand curve and the price up into the amount of units that they buy. At $40, there, according to the demand curve, only 10,000 pairs would be bought. So if we get the area of this, 1/2 times the base of 10 and the height of 20, we get 100, which we know really represents 100,000. So consumer surplus shrank. It shrank from 225 to 100. Of course it did, because consumers don't like higher prices. It sucks for consumers. So of course consumer surplus is going to shrink. And in fact, it's shrinking by the area of this trapezoid here, this train-looking thing. I call it an ice shaver. Doesn't it look like an ice shaver? Have you ever seen a block of ice being shaved? No? Okay, move on. Anyway, there's two reasons that consumer surplus fell. Okay. One is we lost this region. Why do we lose this region? Because these buyers right here, whoever's buying these pairs of shoes, at $40, they're no longer willing and able to pay. Because extend this $40 line across here, look at the price is higher than the demand curve, meaning price is higher than their willingness to pay. So these folks right here, whoever's on this part of the demand curve, they're like, that price is too high, no longer worth it for me. So that's why we lose this part of consumer surplus. This part of consumer surplus, these 10,000 would have been bought either way at $30 or $40. They would have been purchased. But the reason we lose this green region is because for these 10,000 pairs, they're paying a higher price. So yes, they'll still buy it, but they're a little less yes about it, right? So the loss in this yes for those who would still purchase it is this green area. And you should be able to compute this, right? I can ask you, hey, exam question number 22, what is the change in consumer surplus due to the price increase? And you would say, oh, it's 10 times 10,000, or 10 times 10 since we're not using the thousands, so it's 100, right? This green region. So again, there's a bunch of questions I can ask you here. I can ask you, what's total consumer surplus at a price of $30? The previously full blue triangle. What's consumer surplus at a price of $40? The pink one. What's the loss in consumer surplus due to the change in quantity? That's the blue region. All right. So again, be prepared to answer questions about this. By the way, this can go in the opposite direction as well, where we start off at $40 and we go from the pink region to the big triangle, the big blue one, what was blue before, and we gain the green because the price dropped for these 10,000 units, and we gain the blue because now these buyers are deciding to purchase the good, right? So very similar analysis with the price drop instead. Okay, moving on to the supply curve. This chapter, like I said, is where we pick up the tool, and it's actually a pretty easy chapter. So that when we jump into the next two chapters, we got chapter 7. We're pros at consumer surplus and producer surplus. We can just move on and compute these things and identify them. Okay, so put your supplier hat on. Remember that the supply curve ranks. It's a ranking of the cost of production. And we're going to do something similar to, asking ourselves, well, who would buy it at a particular price? Here we're going to say, who would sell it at a particular price? So our sellers are Jack, Janet, and Chrissy. And they are actually also representing some people. So the buyers on the previous example for consumer surplus, Anthony, John, Chad, and Flea, they were the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And these folks here, you probably won't be able to guess who they are. They are the characters from a show from, I think, the 70s and the 80s maybe, called Three's Company. And I used to watch it when I was little. And I'm not that old, folks. Maybe I hope I was watching reruns. I don't know. I don't know when it first came out, but I used to watch it. And so it was Jack, Janet, and Chrissy, Three's Company, if you want to Google that, so you can put faces to these names, but you don't have to. Anyway, so they're producers for lawn cutting. And of course, our low-cost producer is going to be a man. No, it just happens to be the case here. Janet is a higher cost producer. To mow a lawn, it costs her $20, and then Chrissy's the highest cost producer. Okay, so we're going to ask each time at a particular price, who would be producing? And why would you produce? You would only produce if the price covers your cost, right? So remember that as a seller, that price needs to cover your costs. So now what we're going to do is get at a measure that looks at the well-being to sellers, and by going through a similar example here. If the price falls between $0 and $9, no one would produce it because everyone has a cost higher than that. Once the price hits $10 or higher, between 10 and 19, Jack at 10 is indifferent, but anything above, and if they're indifferent, just assume they would jump in and produce. And if the price is above, which the 19 is, then of course Jack would produce. When it hits 20, that's when Janet's like, all right, I'm in, right? Or I'm like, on the fence, but it's not going to hurt me to do it if I'm Janet. But if it's above 20, like 21, 22, 23, 34, well, then hell yeah, Janet wants to produce it. Okay. And then 35 and up, that's when Chrissy would be willing to provide the good to the market. I will take a moment right now to remind you that when we're talking about cost in an economics class, we mean full opportunity costs. So if you want to say, well, yeah, that may just be the cost of, the fuel that they need for the lawnmower, but what about the value of their time? You're in an econ class. We're assuming that is included in the cost curves. Okay, and so taking this information, plotting, similar to how we did with the buyers, between 0 and 9, no one wants to provide it. Just a little faster here because we already learned it on the demand side, and this is analogous, except now it's supply. Between 0 and 9, no one wants to buy it. At 10, then Jack's indifferent between not providing it or providing it. But any price higher than 10, he's not indifferent. And here's where Janet joins him, and this is where Chrissy joins in, right? And so this is where definitely 2, because the price is between 20 and 34, so the 2 providing it here would be Jack and Chrissy. And then Chrissy joins in on the fun there, right? So we see their levels here for the marginal seller. There's Jack's cost, there's Janet's cost, and there's Chrissy's cost, right? Where that denotes their indifference. Chrissy's indifferent between joining them at 35, not joining them at 35, so we have 2 quantity supplied, or joining them, so we have 3. But if the price goes above 35, she is not indifferent. She is definitely in. Okay. All right, so this is our supply curve. And I forgot to include an S here for the supply curve. I think also in the kinky demand curve, I forgot to include a D to point out that it is a demand curve. It's just a kinky one. Anyway, so producer surplus is the analogous concept that measures the well-being to sellers from participating in the market. And think about it. You're a seller. When do you go yes, right? You go yes when the price is higher than the cost. Right? That measure of yes, that better offness for you as a seller, you're like, okay, this is what I'm selling my good for. This is what it costs me to make it. The lower the cost compared to the price, the happier you are, right? So, or no matter what your cost is, the higher the price of what you sell, the more better off you are as a seller, right? So producer surplus is the difference between price and cost. And so suppose the price is $25. Ask yourself who would be willing to provide a unit to the market. mow a lawn. Well, Jack would, because his cost is only $10. His consumer surplus is going to be $15. 25 minus 10, and he'd provide 1 unit. And Janet would too. Her producer surplus is smaller, 25 minus 20, so it's only $5, but she's still better off by doing it than not doing it. Chrissy's not joining in though. So Chrissy's producer surplus is 0 because it's not worth it for her. So therefore we have total producer surplus from all participants in the market at a price of $25, which is Jack and Janet, at $20. Okay. And notice that producer surplus is the area below price and above the green supply curve, even though the supply curve looks a little kinky. Okay. So that is how you identify producer surplus, area below price and above the supply curve. It's in the math. Look at this equation. The difference between price and cost is represented on the supply curve. Same thing with demand, by the way. Let's see if I can back up quickly enough. Same thing with demand. Demand, I said it's, or similar to demand. Demand, I said it's the difference between the demand curve and the price, right? The area below demand and price, the difference between willingness to pay and price. Well, willingness to pay is reflected on the demand curve. So graphically, consumer surplus is the area between, or the difference between the demand curve and price up until the amount of units that are sold. And so now if we add more producers to the market so that we're not just looking at a few, therefore so that our curve is not kinky, we smoothen out the supply curve, right? So now the pairs of shoes in this particular example is in thousands, and we have P for price per pair. And we can do a similar type of analysis as we did for the buyer side. We can ask at a particular price, $40, what is producer surplus? First, let's look at the marginal seller. Okay. For this particular pair of shoes, the 15,000th pair of shoes, the cost of production according to the supply curve is $30. The cost of production for the 5,000th pair is what, like $20. Okay. So focus on this pair, that's the marginal pair. And if the cost is here at $30 and they can sell it for 40, therefore the difference between 40 and 30, $10, is the producer surplus. Now aggregate across all of these units. This one, price is 40, here's the cost, so that producer surplus, plus the producer surplus of this unit, here's the cost, there's the price they're selling it at, so it's that little arrow between there and there, that distance. Aggregate across all of these units here, we get this pink region. This is the total producer surplus from providing goods to the market when the price is $40. Who's providing it? Only those lower cost producers for which the price it's the case that the price covers their cost. Here's the price up above their cost. These higher cost producers aren't producing. These units are more expensive to produce. They're not being produced. Why? Because cost is above that price. Pull out that price line way over here. Notice that the supply curve, if I pull out that price line out here, draw it out, that cost curve, the supply curve, is above price. So they don't want to provide those units, whoever's making these. So now we can find producer surplus at a price of $40, get the area of the triangle, 1/2 times the base times the height. Well, the base is this part here, 25, and the height is 40 minus 15. So 25 times, it happens to be 25 times 25. Here's the base, here's the height. And we get $312.50 of producer surplus, of better offness to producers for market participation, of them walking away from the market and going, yes! And again, buyers and sellers will only do that, assuming markets are voluntary, that they are voluntarily being there. They are free markets. No one's forcing them to be there. You're only going to participate in the market if you walk away that way, right? We're not modeling, by the way, mistakes. Do you ever buy anything and you're like, oh, shoot, I shouldn't have done that. I felt pressured. Okay, yeah. Next time you're not going to do it again, though, right? So that's not what we're modeling. We're not modeling things that like burn us and we learn from. We're modeling things that are tendencies, right? So yeah, we're going to tend to participate if we walk away with some yes, whether we're some buyers or whether we are buyers or whether we are sellers. In other words, if we walk away with some surplus. And since, by the way, here, since the shoes are measured in thousands, this is really $312,500. All right, so we've introduced you, or I've introduced you, and the book has introduced you to both consumer surplus and producer surplus. And the last thing I need to do here is to look at the impact on producer surplus from a change in price. And in our example, we're going to assume that price drops, but we could have done a similar analysis for a price increase. If price drops, producer surplus, which again is the difference between price and the supply curve up until the amount of units that they'd be willing to provide, so up until 15,000 here. Get that area, you get this value. And we lost the pink region up here in producer surplus. That should make sense that producer surplus have lower surplus when the price drops because producers do not like low prices. They like high prices. And so we can get that, break that up into two parts. They lost this blue part here because these producers, these units are high cost units. It doesn't make sense for them to make them anymore at this lower price. So they leave or they don't provide the good to the market. They decide not to produce it. So that's why we lose this blue. But we lose this green because those who decided to still produce, these folks here, these firms that make these units, they're like, yeah, we'll still make them because the price covers our costs, but it sucks that the price dropped. And this sucks measures, this is measured here, right? This loss in producer surplus in this green region. I said earlier that you can do it with a price increase. Sure, just pretend that we're instead going from 30 to 40. You gain this whole region up here for similar reasons, right? You gain this because those who make the 15,000 are getting a higher price. They're like, hell yeah. And you gain this because these people, these firms weren't willing to provide it before, but now they are, right? So again, similar type of analysis, just reverse the way you're analyzing it. Okay, we are ready to put these two things together. Notice that we have consumer surplus, which is willingness to pay. Actually, let me go to my tablet here. We'll wrap this chapter up on my tablet. So let's put these ideas together. I am at a house full of dogs. And there's also a party next door, but I tested it and it sounds like you cannot hear the loud noise. All right, so we have our negatively sloped demand curve and we have our positively sloped supply curve. And we're combining these two ideas now. We know that in equilibrium, assuming the market can get here, which most markets can, so we're going to assume that markets are what we call efficient, and I'll get to that in a bit. The market doesn't fail to be efficient. And so here's our price, P star, and there's our quantity, Q star. Well, we know what consumer surplus is. Consumer surplus is going to be this region right here. This is consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is the difference between willingness to pay and the price paid up until the amount of units that they buy. Right? So this pink region, I'm sorry about that dog. The pink region is consumer surplus, right? The difference between willingness to pay and the price paid. And for producers, so let me write that down actually. Consumer surplus is the difference between willingness to pay minus the price paid. That is consumer surplus. Producer surplus is the difference between the price they get paid, producers, and the cost of production up until the amount of units that they sell. So up till Q star. So producer surplus, as we talked about earlier, is this region here. So that is producer surplus. And remember, producer surplus in equation form is the difference between price and the cost of production. Cost being reflected on the supply curve, willingness to pay being reflected by the demand curve. And so if we add both of these things up, we get what is known as total surplus. Total surplus, TS. Total surplus. Total surplus is the benefits to all market participants, to both buyers and sellers. And what is that equal to? Look at these equations. We have WTP, willingness to pay minus price, plus price minus cost. And the negative price and the positive price cancel out. So we're left with total surplus is the difference between willingness to pay and cost. In other words, total surplus is the difference between the demand curve and the supply curve up until the amount of units that they exchange. And that's exactly what we have here. Total surplus is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus up until the amount of units that they exchange. This is total surplus here, the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. Almost all markets can get here. And this is what we call an efficient market. If a market is efficient, we maximize total surplus. There's no way to make the benefits from market participation any bigger. This is as big as they can be. Total surplus is maximized. And we can see this if we deviate from here. Okay? And let me show you. By the way, what I mean by most markets can get here on their own, that means the government doesn't need to get involved to get us to this place right here, to equilibrium. Almost all markets can get there on their own. They don't fail. There's no market failure. A market failure is when the market fails to be efficient. And almost all markets can get here. There's some that don't, and I'll give you some examples. So for example, a monopoly, which we'll cover later. Actually, it's one of the last things we cover. A monopolist has market power. They're the only seller in the market, so they're not going to want to be at P star. What do you think they're going to want to do to the price? Drop it or increase it? They're going to want to increase that price. So they're not going to want to be at P star. If they're the only seller in the market, of course they're going to move that price away from P star and jack it up. So then that means they take us away from this point here, right? And so that would be an inefficient outcome. So a monopoly leads to market failure. The market fails to be efficient. That's one example. There are other examples, and we will be covering some of them. But for now, we're going to assume we're working with efficient markets. And let me show you that surplus necessarily shrinks if we deviate from this, what I'll call the happy place, the equilibrium. So let's say we deviate to the left. There's demand. There's supply. There's demand. There's demand and there's supply. And let's say we're not at Q star and we deviate to the left. We'll call this Q left. QL for left. That's a Q, by the way. QL for left. So we don't go to Q star. Here's Q star. We stop here. Look at what happens. Yeah, we pick this up in surplus because here's willingness to pay. And here's cost of production, because remember, total surplus is the difference between willingness to pay and the cost. But we stop short of maximizing surplus. So total surplus just ends up being this region in here, as opposed to being including this that I checked with the check mark. So we stop short of having surplus as big as possible if we deviate to the left of Q star. By the way, anytime we lose surplus, this region here, loss in surplus because of whatever reason, we call it dead weight loss. Loss in total surplus. Okay, dead weight loss. We'll be introduced to this concept in the next chapter. So there's dead weight loss. There's loss in surplus. There's loss in economic pie. The economic pie shrunk. The goodness, the yes, total yes, shrank in the market. Okay, so that's when we deviate to the left. But even when we deviate to the right, that also leads to less surplus. Like I told you, there's no way to make total surplus any bigger than when you get to Q star. At Q star and P star, total surplus is maximized. There's no way to increase it. The economic pie is as big as it can be. There's no more better offedness from the existence of the market. And so this is kind of like a graphical proof, these two graphs combined, or these two plots combined. So there's demand, there's supply, here's Q star. Suppose we deviate to the right, to QR for right. And so at that right unit, look at this. At that right unit, sure, for these units here, that's goodness, right? Willingness to pay exceeds cost. So we pick all this up in positive surplus because willingness to pay exceeds cost. But when we produce these units between here and here, the cost of production is higher than what buyers value the good at. So if they trade in these two goods, This is a loss to society. There is no price at which both of them are better off if we trade in this space here. No price where they're both better off. Someone's always going to be worse off. So again, you could just think of it in terms of the cost exceeds the value that consumers place on these particular goods. And let me show you what I meant by there's no price at which both of them are better off. So let's focus on these units between Q star and QR. Suppose the price, actually let's do sellers and buyers. Here, it'll be silly, but it'll get the point across. Let's say sellers are circles, and so these are sellers, and buyers are triangles. Okay. Suppose the price is up here for the unit between Q star and QR. Well, the price is higher than cost, so sellers are pretty happy about that. That's a happy face. If you couldn't tell, let's make it a little bigger. There we go. So sellers are pretty happy about that. But buyers, that price is way above what they value the good at. So buyers are not happy. Buyers aren't happy. What about a price in between the two curves? Somewhere here, or here, or here, doesn't matter. That is below cost, right? Because the cost is right here for that unit right here. And here's what buyers value it at. And so what's the result here? If the price is below cost, then sellers are not happy. But the price is now above what the price is above what buyers value it at. So both buyers and sellers are not happy. And what if the price is below the demand curve down here? Well, now the seller's pissed off still, even worse off, right? And the buyers, they're happy because their price is below their cost. Below their willingness to pay. But the buyers are happy, the sellers aren't. The sellers wouldn't want to trade. So if they do trade out there, there's no way that they're all going to be happy at the same time, right? Someone will want to pull out unless they are forced to be there. Unless we are forced to be at QR, somewhere to the right of Q star, which can happen. Not so much in free markets and in economies like in the United States. But my whole point here is that it would lead to inefficiency. So yes, you pick up all the goodness of the blue on the left, right? The positive surplus on the left, but this stuff here on the right ends up being a loss, right? So we're adding, I'll shade it in red. We're adding to the blue surplus, we're adding a negative number. So it's kind of like if we ate into this. It's kind of like if we really lost, let me do it in red. If we kind of chopped off this part right here. Right? That's kind of what it is, right? So technically, surplus is smaller. Yeah, you pick up all that blue, but you negate a bit of it with that red because that red is negative. So again, this was kind of a graphical proof of how, unless you're at Q star, total surplus has to shrink. Okay? So this is what we mean by efficiency. At P star Q star, the market is efficient. The market is allocating resources such that they're going to their most valued use, and they're being produced by the low-cost producers. Think about that. Let's draw this again. If we're here, we're exchanging Q star units. These units are going to their most valued use, this part of the demand curve, willingness and ability to pay. A lot of it could be constrained by ability, right? Like, again, I want it, but I can't buy it. So, going to the highest willingness to pay over here, but then also being produced by the lower cost producers. That is efficient, right? By the way, this says nothing about it being equitable. Nothing, not a word about that. So while the size of the economic pie is as big as it can possibly be, that does not mean that the distribution of the slices are even or equal or quote unquote fair. Okay. By the way, the concept of fair doesn't exist in economics, right? Because we don't have opinions in here in the classroom. And we shouldn't, because we're here to learn how to measure these things. That does not mean that I, Professor Morales, as soon as I shut down my tablet here and stop recording, that I don't have opinions. Of course I have fucking opinions. Of course I do. But I am here to teach you these tools. I, as an economist, I know these tools and I know the limitations of it. For example, this one right here. Yeah, we're all focusing on efficiency, 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 and the economy can be super efficient. But it is possible that all the winnings go to more few people than the masses, say. That is possible, and we know actually in the United States that, for example, income is highly, highly unequal. Right? Highly, highly skewed, that the 1% gets the majority, way more than 50% of total income. I'm not saying that's good or that's bad. I'm saying that that means that the distribution of the slices are not equal. Again, outside of this classroom, I have strong opinions, but here I am here to teach you these things. So as you learned in chapter 1, there's a trade-off between the two. Right? You might want to reallocate resources. Okay, if you want to do that, you give up some economic pie, some efficiency. If you want to move us from Q star, okay, that's fine, but know the implications of that. But again, also remember that, like just like in that minimum wage example, yeah, minimum wages lead to unemployment, but we saw that it leads to actually empirically in the real world to very little of it. Right? So maybe in a place, maybe this is up to you and your values and our society's values. Maybe we're willing to give up some economic pie, given how much pie we have in the US, for the sake of some equality. Maybe, right? Or maybe not. Maybe you're here, you're like, no, fuck that. Okay, well, that's you. And society as a whole is the one or the ones who ultimately determine that, right? Not just you, not just me. All right, so this is this chapter in a nutshell.